The same hands that tried to break you will one day tremble at the sight of who you became. My dear chosen ones, gather your strength, because this is not the chapter where you whisper. This is where you finally realize that what happened to you was not a mix-up, not bad timing, not life being unfair just because. No, it was intentional. It was designed. It was executed with cold logic and quiet calculation by people who believed you would stay soft, silent, and unaware forever. They didn't slip and forget to show mercy. Mercy wasn't even in their vocabulary. They treated you like a disposable experiment, convinced that your silence meant safety for them and invisibility for you. They bet on the wrong soul. They overlooked the wrong heart. They misread the wrong warrior. Let's rewrite the headline of your life in idiomatic style. No more, Mr. Nice Soul. Good hearts don't mean free passes. Because chosen ones, let's keep it painfully honest. They thought they could damage you and walk away whistling like it was nothing. They thought they could rewrite your identity while protecting theirs. They thought your quiet was weakness when it was your loading phase. They thought you wouldn't connect the dots because you didn't react instantly, but silence is not confusion. Silence is data collection. People who lack empathy live inside a mental illusion where they believe the absence of immediate consequence equals the absence of consequence altogether. They truly imagine that if no one calls them out, nothing counts. It's like criminals who smile for mugshots, delusional enough to think the camera is admiration instead of evidence. That's the exact fog they were living in. They thought you would either not notice or not matter. They didn't realize that chosen ones don't yell, they evolve, and evolution speaks louder than confrontation ever could. You may ask yourself now, why me? Why did they target someone who only meant well? Chosen ones, let's answer that clearly. Predators don't chase what's dangerous. They chase what appears undefended. They saw your kindness not as intelligence but as access. They read your empathy not as depth but as ignorance. They interpreted your patience as an open-door policy for disrespect. They thought you were someone who would suffer quietly forever, never questioning, never detaching, never rising. They measured you only by the version of you they met, not the version of you that was forming. And now the part that stings them the most, you didn't just survive, you adapted. Trauma became your curriculum, silence became your strategy, and observation became your superpower. Every time they tried to wound you, they handed you knowledge. Every time they underestimated you, they trained your intuition. Every time they tried to dim you, they accidentally sharpened your vision. They thought they were writing your ending, but they were unknowingly helping you draft your evolution report. Now consequences are circling them like unclaimed luggage, stamped, tagged, and unmistakably theirs. They look stunned because they believed their actions evaporated just because you didn't scream. Isn't it fascinating how the boldest villains suddenly develop amnesia when life presses playback? They were architects of chaos but forgot to draw an escape route. They believed they were pulling strings but never questioned whose hands built the stage. They played offense with zero awareness that life always plays defense, quietly, precisely, and eventually. Before we move forward, chosen ones, if this message is resonating with your spirit, your story, or your silent strength, take a moment to support this journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement isn't just a click. It fuels the mission, keeps this content alive, and empowers us to continue delivering more powerful, transformative, and energizing messages made specifically for people like you. Every like, comment, and subscription tells the world that there are still warriors who refuse to break and voices that deserve to be heard. Let's grow this community of awareness, resilience, and rise together. Chosen ones, do you feel that shift inside you? That inner voice that no longer stutters? That awareness that no longer doubts? That calmness that no longer negotiates? That is what scares them now. They can sense that the energy has flipped, not because you've become loud, but because you've become unavailable. You are no longer reacting, you are recalibrating. You are no longer wounded, you are weaponized, not against people, but against your old patterns. You didn't get here by luck. You got here through endurance, reflection, self-awareness, and psychological evolution. The pain they thought would bury you turned into the very soil that rooted you. You rose through the pressure like a sealed seed, silent, unseen, but unstoppable. Chosen ones, remember this. Your story is not about what they did. It's about who you became anyway. And trust me, the final chapter won't be whispered. It will be witnessed. Chosen ones, before we move deeper into this powerful breakdown, take a moment to stay connected with this movement built for people who've walked through silent battles and came out sharper. If this message already feels like it's speaking from inside your own story, show your energy by liking this video, subscribing, and commenting "Rise Mode activated" so we know you're part of the unstoppable circle. Your support keeps this content raw, real, and fiercely uplifting for those who need it most. And now, let's continue. Because if you truly are a chosen one, you're about to recognize the exact patterns that proved what they did wasn't accidental, and why the repercussions are unfolding now. Number 1, they studied your scars but never discovered your system. They judged the bruises, not the blueprint. They thought your silence meant defeat, not strategy. That will forever be their biggest misread. My dear chosen ones, it's time to expose the first and most critical miscalculation they made. They believed your pain was all there was to you. They assumed your wounds were the entire story, not realizing they were only looking at the surface, while something far more advanced, far more complex, and far more powerful was happening underneath. They were analyzing symptoms. They never studied your system. They wrote entire narratives based on temporary moments, never caring to explore what was permanent within you. Chosen ones, listen closely. They watched the version of you that was tired, hurt, confused, mentally stretched, emotionally exhausted, and carrying invisible scars. They assumed that version was final, never considering it was just an unfinished chapter. To them, your vulnerability looked like identity, your silence looked like surrender, and your pause looked like collapse. They thought your life was falling apart, when in reality you were falling into alignment. They didn't understand that some people break down because they're weak, and others break down because it's time to rebuild with upgraded parts. You might wonder, how could they think they understood me based only on my broken moments? Because chosen ones, people who operate on shallow perception, cannot comprehend those built with deep internal architecture. They judged you like a flat image, not knowing you were a multi-layered design. They calculated their attacks by observing your emotional limp, not realizing you were only limping because you were outgrowing everything around you. Old environments, outdated connections, and expired versions of yourself. They didn't know discomfort is often the first sign of transformation, not destruction. They saw you quiet and assumed you were defeated. They didn't realize quiet people are the ones who build mental war rooms. They saw you isolated and assumed you were abandoned. They didn't see that solitude is where chosen ones recalibrate, reorganize, and reinvent. They saw your tears as weakness, not understanding tears are the body's way of making space, releasing what's heavy so what's stronger can be installed. They saw you pulling back, not realizing withdrawal is preparation, not failure. They thought they were attacking your weak points, not realizing those weak points were actually entry points for your evolution. They didn't know that chosen ones are wired differently, not emotionally numb, but emotionally adaptive, not unhurt, but unbreakable, not ignorant, but highly perceptive, not fragile, but under construction. Your wiring wasn't built for temporary survival. It was built for long-term elevation, long-term clarity, and long-term endurance. Chosen ones, let's clarify something powerful. What they believed was your breaking point was actually your upgrade installation period. While they were bragging, gossiping, and assuming they had successfully damaged your confidence, you were quietly processing every detail, documenting patterns, learning human behavior, sharpening boundaries, and strengthening emotional muscles that most people will never develop in their entire lifetime. They were celebrating your silence, not realizing silence is where chosen ones master self-control, emotional detachment, and strategic thinking. They were fighting the old version of you, the version that didn't know how to say no, didn't recognize manipulation quickly, didn't understand hidden intentions, and didn't know your value at full volume. What they didn't realize was that you were evolving behind the scenes with upgraded clarity, upgraded standards, upgraded resilience, and upgraded instinct. They were still launching attacks at a version of you that no longer existed. What makes this even more ironic is that their entire plan depended on you staying weak. Their confidence depended on you staying unaware. Their satisfaction depended on your wounds remaining open. Their strategy depended on you never learning how to heal. They needed you to be emotionally limited, but you were never built for emotional limitations. You were built for emotional expansion. They confuse wounds with weakness because they've never healed themselves. They underestimate silence because they're terrified of their own. They misread reflection because they avoid introspection. They mistake endurance for permission because they have never met someone who can hurt and evolve at the same time. And now, chosen ones, here's where everything flips. Everything they built against you is collapsing. Not because you retaliated, but because their strategy was based on outdated data. They were so busy studying your broken chapters that they missed the moment you started writing the comeback edition. They underestimated someone whose pain activates development instead of destruction. They thought suffering would finish you, not realizing suffering was refining you. They lost because they gambled on a temporary version of someone who was built for long-term growth. They bet against a blueprint they never understood. They underestimated a mindset that recalibrates instead of collapses. They attacked while you were upgrading, and now they realize you were never weak, you were simply loading. My dear chosen ones, never forget this truth. They didn't fail because you fought back. They failed because they never understood who they were fighting, and that realization will haunt them longer than anything you ever could have said. Number 2, their attacks weren't emotional outbursts. They were psychological blueprints. They didn't just hurt you. They tried to rewrite your identity. When they couldn't erase your potential, they tried to convince you it never existed. My dear chosen ones, let's uncover the brutal truth behind their behavior. What you experienced wasn't emotional clumsiness, it wasn't accidental cruelty, and it wasn't toxic behavior they couldn't control. It was a targeted psychological operation designed to alter how you see yourself. They weren't just trying to win an argument or gain temporary superiority. They were playing a long game built on identity erosion. They believed that if they could distort your inner narrative, they would never have to lift another finger to hold you back, because you would unknowingly hold yourself back. They weren't trying to damage your day, they were trying to damage your definition. Chosen one, think about it. They didn't attack your achievements, they attacked your self-concept. They didn't try to break your habits, they tried to break your confidence. They didn't try to steal your possessions, they tried to steal your perception. People like this don't need weapons, storms, or armies. All they need is to make you doubt yourself. Once doubt contamination happens, they know you'll start questioning your worth, your intuition, your abilities, your potential, your decisions, your dreams, and even your identity. They understand the psychology. If they can get inside your mind, they never have to block your path. You will do it for them. And they didn't do it loudly, dear chosen one. They were too strategic for that. They chose whispers over wars, sarcasm over shouting, embarrassment over evidence, and emotional confusion over physical confrontation. They wanted you disoriented, not defended. They wanted you second-guessing everything, especially the parts of yourself once rooted in certainty. They chipped away slowly because slow damage doesn't trigger immediate defense. It triggers gradual collapse. This is why they mocked your ambition like it was a joke. This is why they reacted like your emotions were exaggerated or delusional. This is why they questioned your decisions as if you were incapable of thinking clearly. This is why they minimized your achievements until they seemed accidental instead of earned. They were working to shrink you from the inside out. Chosen ones, identity attacks are the most dangerous form of cruelty because the wounds are invisible to others but catastrophic internally. They don't leave bruises, they leave belief systems. They don't break bones, they break self-trust. They don't silence your voice, they make you silence it yourself. They were not random in their cruelty, they were strategic in their intention. Notice how they'd push you right when you began feeling proud. Notice how criticism replaced support the moment you showed potential. Notice how they turned cold right when you started evolving. That was not coincidence. That was control. Their ultimate fear was not who you were, but who you were becoming. But here is where their entire plan collapsed. You were never shaped by their opinions. You were shaped by your internal blueprint, and that blueprint is not editable, not transferable, not deletable, and not up for negotiation. They were trying to modify a system they never built. They were trying to overwrite programming they didn't install. They were trying to discredit a strength they never contributed to. You were evolving the entire time they were attempting to erase you, and chosen one, here's the poetic twist. The pressure they applied became the proof you needed. The more they tried to distort your identity, the more you learned how to protect it. The more they tried to weaken your self-image, the more you recognized the value of it. The more they tried to make you feel small, the more you began to understand you were anything but. Their attempts didn't break you, they revealed you. Because here's a secret they never predicted. When chosen ones survive psychological sabotage, they don't return to who they were. They upgrade into who they were always meant to be. You became aware of projection, manipulation, and emotional tactics. You learned to separate lies from truth, intention from behavior, words from patterns. You grew a sense of identity so unshakable that not even your past insecurities can access it anymore. And now they face repercussions, not because you're seeking revenge, but because the identity they tried to rewrite is now the very identity shining too brightly for their lies to survive. They didn't realize the ending they scripted was never theirs to publish. Chosen one, never forget this. They didn't fail because you fought them. They failed because you remembered who you were long after they tried to make you forget. Number 3, they confused your self-control with silent approval. When silence was strategy, they mistook it for surrender. Chosen ones, let's address one of the most dangerous assumptions your adversaries ever made about you. They mistook your endurance for permission. They convinced themselves that because you didn't react, retaliate, scream, prove, or defend, you were somehow fine with what they were doing. They believed your emotional composure was consent. They truly thought that your patience meant approval and your silence meant weakness. But endurance is never weakness when it belongs to someone who knows their worth, someone who sees life in long game format, someone who refuses to waste time on meaningless battles. They didn't understand that the strongest people are not the loudest ones. The strongest people are the ones who can stay calm inside a storm that was engineered to break them. See, chosen ones don't respond immediately because they're not driven by ego, impulse, or panic. They're driven by clarity, timing, and awareness. You weren't quiet because you lacked a voice. You were quiet because you refused to entertain chaos. You weren't passive. You were observant. You weren't scared. You were evaluating. You weren't numb. You were calculating. And you weren't confused. You were collecting psychological evidence that would one day become your final decision. While they were trying to provoke response, you were mastering self-regulation. While they tried to pull you into their emotional battlefield, you remained grounded on yours. The truth is, chosen ones don't react instantly because they understand that not every action is worthy of a counteraction. They know when confrontation is necessary and when silence is superior. They know when words are wasted and when distance is the only language that exposes the truth. But the ones who hurt you lacked the maturity to comprehend that level of emotional intelligence. They live in a world where loudness equals power, where impulse equals strength, where reaction equals validation. So when you remained calm, they assumed you were powerless. When you didn't snap, they assumed you accepted it. When you didn't walk away immediately, they assumed you never would. What they never realized is that endurance in a chosen one is not a free pass. It's a final warning disguised as grace. You didn't explode because you were in control. You didn't fight because you saw no victory in pointless confrontation. You didn't react because you weren't trying to convince anyone of your value. You already knew it. And while they thought you were tolerating their behavior, you were silently measuring it. Every word, every dismissal, every manipulation, every inconsistency, every disrespect. You were noting patterns, not out of revenge, but out of understanding. You were allowing them to reveal their entire character with no interference. They kept pushing because they mistook emotional intelligence for emotional fragility. They kept violating boundaries because they believed you didn't have the courage to set them. They kept playing mind games because they assumed you were too naive to notice. But chosen ones don't always announce their awareness. Sometimes they simply watch long enough to confirm it, and that is where their downfall began. Because once clarity is complete, chosen ones don't negotiate, they exit. When a chosen one finally withdraws, it is not temporary, emotional, impulsive, or dramatic. It is absolute. It is the moment when silence turns into permanent distance, where availability becomes access denied, and that is what destroys them. Not your anger, not your confrontation, not your explanation, but your absence. People who take advantage become bold in environments where there are no immediate consequences. They climb higher on your tolerance ladder, believing it's a staircase, not realizing it's a ledge. They think they're getting away with something, not realizing they're building their own downfall with every careless behavior. The worst part? They felt safe mistreating you because you never fought back until suddenly you stopped participating. Chosen ones, there's a psychological truth. People don't fear losing what they think they control. They fear losing what they never truly understood. They are shocked now because they thought they knew you. They thought they could predict you. They thought nothing would change. They assumed access was permanent because you didn't revoke it immediately. But you do not move like the average person. You don't react instantly. You respond intentionally. And now the very endurance they mocked has become the reason everything they built is collapsing. They cannot replace what they took for granted. They cannot fix what they destroyed through repetition. They cannot undo what was revealed through time. Their consequences did not come from your retaliation. They came from your evolution. So hear this, chosen ones. Your silence was never submission. Your endurance was never acceptance. Your patience was never permission. It was your way of giving them the rope, and they proved what they would do with it. Number 4, they spent energy they never had. And now the bill has arrived. They built a debt their future can't carry. My dear chosen ones, let's talk about one of the most brutal mistakes your enemies made. They didn't just hurt you, they went into energetic overdraft without realizing it. They behaved as if life was a playground with no accountability, as if actions evaporate once the moment passes, as if cruelty disappears when no one is watching. They didn't understand that every conscious choice, every hidden intention, every calculated blow creates an invisible balance sheet, one that never loses track of what is taken, what is owed, and what must eventually return. People assume the only consequences that exist are the ones written in policies, spoken in arguments, or settled through apologies. They think if no one calls them out, if no social punishment appears, if no direct confrontation happens, then they're free. But chosen ones, there is another system operating behind everything, not controlled by courts, society, or approval, but by energetic law, cause and effect, and the unfiltered truth of motive. And in that system, no lie is forgotten, no manipulation is erased, no betrayal expires, and no cruelty becomes irrelevant simply because time passes. When someone harms a chosen one intentionally, they are not just behaving badly. They are crossing into a zone they are not mentally or emotionally equipped to navigate. They're not just disrespecting you, they're borrowing against their own future without awareness of the interest rate. They are taking from a source they did not build, draining what they did not contribute to, and acting as though there will never be a demand for repayment. And chosen ones, every silent attack they committed, every setup they crafted, every smear they whispered, every moment they smirked at your struggle, added another layer to the deficit they created. They thought they were just being clever. They never saw they were signing invisible contracts. Every sarcastic jab, every manipulation attempt, every selfish move was a digital signature. They assumed because you didn't react, it didn't count. They assumed because no one exposed them, they were safe. They assumed because you stayed silent, life didn't notice. Their arrogance tricked them into believing that absence of punishment meant absence of consequence. Oh, chosen ones, how wrong they were. There is nothing more dangerous than someone who believes they are untouchable. Their confidence didn't come from intelligence, it came from ignorance. They mistook delayed consequences as non-existent consequences. They mistook your emotional maturity as permission. They mistook silence as weakness rather than wisdom, and now life is presenting the invoice they never expected, never prepared for, and never believed existed. This repayment isn't happening because you wished harm, plotted revenge, or wanted to see them break. The universe of cause and effect doesn't function like a punishment system. It functions like a balancing system. When energy is stolen, it must return. When someone inflicts damage willingly, repair must occur. When someone takes joy in someone else's suffering, their own path becomes harder, not because of vengeance, but because imbalance must always find equilibrium. That's why things are starting to go wrong for them in ways they cannot explain. Doors that used to open easily are now locked. People who once supported them suddenly don't show up. Plans that used to succeed now fall apart for reasons that seem random. Opportunities slip through their fingers like sand. Their name no longer attracts favor. Their confidence turns into confusion. Their routine becomes resistance. They aren't unlucky. They are experiencing the interest of what they once took without permission. The same walls they built to trap you are now sealing around them. The same gossip they used to isolate you is now isolating them. The same manipulation they used to gain advantage is now working against their own stability. They believed they were the puppeteers. Now they're tangled in their own strings. Chosen ones, what's most powerful here is that you didn't have to break them, expose them, sabotage them, or even speak against them. Life handled the calculations, time arranged the delivery. Reality distributed the outcomes. You simply evolved, healed, detached, and moved into alignment. And that alone shifted everything. Remember this, some people don't fall because someone pushed them. They fall because life eventually demands payment, and they spent more than they were ever capable of earning. And for those who intentionally harmed you while laughing, celebrating, or pretending it was harmless, repayment has only just begun. Number 5. They tried a slow collapse, not knowing you were built for long-term rebuild mode. They played a marathon of manipulation, never realizing you were built for a full-scale rebuild. Let's make one thing crystal clear, my dear chosen ones. Not every attack arrives with noise, drama, or public explosions. Some attacks are delivered in silence, drip by drip, like poison disguised as patience. Some enemies don't swing fast. They move slow, quiet, and calculated. They aren't impulsive, they are strategic. They don't throw punches, they plant patterns, and that is exactly what happened to you. The harm you endured wasn't spontaneous, it was mapped out. They didn't want a quick reaction, they wanted a gradual collapse. They wanted you to crumble in slow motion, so even you wouldn't recognize your own decline. They were architects of mental erosion. They didn't try to destroy you in one blow, because even they knew you wouldn't fall easily. So what did they do? They studied your emotional rhythm, your weak moments, your kindness, your attachment style, and your instinct to forgive. They collected information like spies. They didn't attack the person you were in public. They attacked the version of you only seen in private. Tired, empathetic, trusting, loyal, and emotionally exposed. They didn't need to shout to cause damage. They just needed time, access, and your belief that they cared. Chosen ones, some people don't want to hurt you accidentally. They want to hurt you efficiently. That's why they didn't rush. They nudged boundaries, tested limits, and slowly conditioned you to accept what you once would have rejected. They gifted compliments only to earn emotional credit they later used as leverage. They disguised sabotage as concern. They disguised discouragement as advice. They disguised jealousy as protection. They disguised manipulation as connection. They weren't just participating in your life, they were engineering the architecture of your emotional breakdown. But here's the part that still burns them. They thought your quietness meant defeat. They believed your fatigue meant surrender. They mistook your emotional pause for emotional expiration. They thought your silence was you giving up. They had no idea your silence was your reconstruction period, the phase only true chosen ones understand. See, an ordinary person breaks under long-term pressure, but chosen ones, we adapt, we shift, we reprogram. We become a new version that requires a new code, a code they were never smart enough to decode. What they thought was the end was actually the incubation chamber of your next level. Your setbacks weren't signs of weakness, they were signals that your old version could no longer hold your next identity. Your tiredness wasn't proof of failure. It was evidence you were shedding emotional weight. Your isolation wasn't punishment, it was recalibration. Your silence wasn't lost voice, it was upgraded thinking. They wanted you drained, confused, isolated, and emotionally dependent. They wanted you believing that your power was gone forever. They wanted you questioning your worth until you couldn't look in a mirror without doubting your identity. And for a moment, yes, you felt it. You questioned yourself. You wondered why your energy was changing. You wondered why you didn't feel like you. But what you didn't realize was that transformation doesn't feel like empowerment at first. It feels like disassembly. Chosen ones, remember this forever. The long game they played against you accidentally trained you for longevity, mental clarity, emotional intelligence, and internal strength. They thought they were wearing you down, but they were conditioning your endurance. They thought they were draining your confidence, but they were removing illusions. They thought they were isolating you, but they were cutting off the noise required for your upgrade. And now, the plot twist hits them harder than anything they ever attempted. The long game they designed for your downfall became your blueprint for elevation. While they were focused on breaking you, they neglected their growth, their development, and their self-awareness. They invested so much time monitoring you that they forgot to evolve themselves. They spent all their emotional bandwidth on your destruction and left none for their own future. So now, chosen ones, here is the beautiful reversal. You survived what they planned, not what happened accidentally. You thrived after what was constructed, not what was circumstantial. And the very endurance they attempted to drain is the one thing they will never recover from. They built your collapse in theory. You built your comeback in reality, and that is why you rise, while they remain trapped inside the blueprint they created. Number 6. It was never personal. You were just the easiest door they thought was unlocked. It was never personal. They were just hunting what looked unprotected. My dear chosen ones, let's get something painfully clear right now. What they did to you was never rooted in genuine conflict, personal history, or some deep emotional reasoning. It wasn't about who you were. It was about what they thought they could do to you. Their actions were not driven by hatred, but by opportunity. They didn't select you because you were weak. They targeted you because your strength was quiet, gentle, and not wrapped in visible armor. Some people seek out open hearts not to appreciate them, but to feed off them. They aren't drawn to power that roars. They're drawn to power that doesn't raise its voice. Predatory minds behave in predictable patterns. They gravitate toward what seems soft, trusting, authentic, and unguarded, not because they value those qualities, but because they believe those qualities can be exploited without repercussions. You, chosen one, were never their enemy. You were their easiest access point, and that is what makes their behavior so twisted. They did not attack out of rivalry, jealousy alone, or emotional conflict. They attacked because they believed you wouldn't fight back. In their world, kindness equals caution tape, empathy equals entryway, patience equals permission. Understand this deeply. You were not hurt because you lacked strength, intelligence, or backbone. You were hurt because you didn't arrive armored, suspicious, or guarded. You weren't trying to play a game, and you didn't assume you were in one. While they strategized, you empathized. While they calculated, you connected. While they tested, you trusted. That difference alone made them believe they had discovered a permanent advantage. Your softness, openness, and sincerity weren't flaws. They were simply qualities they didn't possess, and therefore qualities they could not interpret correctly. People who operate from manipulation cannot decode authenticity. People who thrive on power games cannot comprehend relationships built on truth, so they assumed your heart was weak because theirs was unused. They assumed your silence was fear because they had never mastered restraint. They assumed you wouldn't leave because they didn't understand boundaries. They assumed you didn't notice because they themselves lack awareness. And chosen one, let's address the illusion they lived in. Predators survive off misinterpretation, not strength. They create mental stories such as, you won't notice, you won't react, you won't leave, you won't expose, you won't change. They tell themselves these stories because reality would terrify them. They survive off denial, not dominance. They believed you were predictable, safe to manipulate, unlikely to revolt, and emotionally available no matter how they behaved. But what they never accounted for, what they never prepared for, was your awakening. Your awareness didn't arrive with fireworks. It appeared quietly, like a locked door they suddenly couldn't open. You didn't shout, but you started noticing. You didn't attack, but you stopped agreeing. You didn't chase, but you withdrew access. Your protection wasn't a shield, it was a shift. You didn't announce boundaries, you enforced them, and just like that, the game was no longer theirs to win. This, chosen one, is when the tables turned, not with revenge, but with recognition. Because predators only thrive when unseen. Exposure is their expiration date. The moment you see them clearly, they lose every ounce of influence. Not because they changed, but because you did. Once you recognize someone's intention, their tactics, their tone patterns, their manipulation styles, and their emotional bait, you no longer respond the way they expect. And for someone who relies on predictable reactions, that is the ultimate power cut. Now they scramble, confused, irritated, and uncertain. Not because you harmed them, but because their illusion of dominance evaporated. They once believed they had control over your emotions, access to your energy, influence over your decisions, and confidence in your loyalty. Today, they're confronted with a reality they never imagined. You are no longer accessible in the same emotional currency. The version of you they targeted has retired. Your goodness was never weakness. Your empathy was never naive. Your patience was never lack of awareness, and your silence was never surrender. These qualities are strengths only people with emotional malnutrition fail to understand. Chosen one, you didn't become cold, you became conscious, and consciousness is something predators cannot feed on. Number 7. They fought a single human, not the legacy of resilience you inherited. They misread your bloodline. You were never standing alone. They truly believed they were targeting a lone individual, a single human with no backup, no foundation, and no invisible reinforcement. My dear chosen ones, the people who came against you measured you only by the version of you they could physically see: your age, your current situation, your present emotional state, your visible resources, and what they assumed was your level of mental strength. They never paused long enough to consider that the strength you walk with did not begin with you. They never factored in that your resilience, your instincts, your emotional awareness, and your internal survival system were inherited, transferred, and embedded long before anyone even whispered your name. They thought every attack was landing directly on you. But what they didn't know was that they were striking someone who carried layers of internal protection, wisdom, and learned endurance from generations who survived storms harder than anything your enemies could ever manufacture. Chosen ones, you are not just a product of your own life. You are the continuation of every battle your lineage survived and every evolution your predecessors earned. You are built from people who didn't quit, people who pushed through when everything was stacked against them, people who endured pain without technology, therapy, emotional education, or support systems. Their strength, grit, and psychological resilience did not vanish when they passed. It was passed down. And those who targeted you never did the math. They saw one person but didn't realize they were facing someone whose DNA carried emotional algorithms, survival programming, and mental durability refined through real-life adversity that spanned decades before you were even born. You didn't just arrive, you were equipped. That's why their attacks never landed the way they intended. They miscalculated, thinking you were unguarded, unaware, and vulnerable. But you were operating with inherited instinct, inherited intuition, inherited emotional decoding, and inherited pattern recognition. You ever wonder how you sensed the shift before it was proven? Why you felt the vibe before you saw the action? Why you could predict manipulation before the mask slipped? That's called inherited intelligence, built through generational memory and subconscious awareness. They thought you were reacting from your present, but you were responding using generational data. They assumed you were alone, when in reality you were backed by an entire lineage of psychological blueprints, survival codes, and instinctive defense mechanisms that they had no access to and no clue about. Chosen ones, this is exactly why every attempt to destroy you, isolate you, break you, confuse you, or emotionally ambush you bounced back harder than expected. Their efforts didn't fail by coincidence. They failed because you are not a standalone file. You are an entire encrypted system. You carry internal protection designed by experience, not luck. Every harmful intention they launched didn't just hit the present moment. It collided with generational resilience, causing a rebound effect they never anticipated. They called it karma, bad timing, sudden misfortune, or unseen setbacks. But what they were actually experiencing was the recoil of attacking someone whose inner foundation was not built alone. They stepped into generational territory they did not understand and could not overpower. And now, as repercussions surface, they are confused. They're shocked by how fast things are shifting, how plans fall apart, how doors close, how alliances fade, and how their energy is backfiring with precision. They're questioning why you didn't break, why you didn't lose your mind, why you didn't collapse permanently, and why you seem to be gaining clarity, strength, awareness, and elevation instead of emotional damage. They don't get it because they only saw your face, not your lineage. They saw your temporary pain, but missed your inherited protection. They thought they were fighting someone weak, unaware, or isolated. They never imagined they were attempting to infiltrate a bloodline built on endurance, growth, and silent evolution. Chosen ones, never let people convince you that you survived because it wasn't that serious. You survived because you were never built alone. You survived because you were pre-equipped. You survived because your legacy was stronger than their strategy. They underestimated you because they misread your origin story. And now they are learning a truth that will echo in their memory longer than any apology they will never say. You weren't protected because you were lucky. You were protected because you were never just one person. Number 8. Their old manipulation tactics expired the moment your inner programming updated. You outgrew their control, and that's why their consequences arrived. My dear chosen ones, this is the turning point they never saw coming. The real reason they are facing repercussions now isn't because you finally exposed them, confronted them, or tried to get even. No. The truth is much simpler and much more devastating for them. You matured into someone who can no longer be manipulated. You evolved out of their reach. You became someone their tactics could no longer influence, trigger, or trap. And for people who survive on control, losing access to your reactions is worse than any revenge you could ever deliver. They once believed they could move you like pieces on a strategic board, thinking they were always 3 steps ahead, when in reality they were playing checkers while your mind was mastering silent psychological chess. They assumed they had you figured out because they remembered who you were during your lowest emotional season. They believed that if it worked once, it would work forever. But chosen ones, your evolution is not loud. It is internal, invisible, and undeniable. They didn't notice that every time they tried to provoke your emotions, you were actually learning theirs. Every time they tried to press your buttons, you were studying the wiring of their intentions. Every time they attempted manipulation, you were building immunity. They measured your future by your past, and that is where they sealed their own downfall. They didn't realize growth happens quietly, maturity happens privately, and clarity happens without applause. They didn't hear the inner dialogue where you said, "Never again." They didn't witness the silent boundaries forming in your mind. They didn't recognize when your heart stopped needing validation. They didn't notice when your patience stopped being permission and transformed into emotional intelligence. They didn't see when your loyalty stopped being unquestioned and became conditional. They didn't understand that every tear that once disarmed you later turned into emotional fortification. Chosen ones, once you shifted from reactive to reflective, everything changed. The moment you stopped responding predictably, their power disintegrated. The same insults that once made you doubt yourself suddenly became irrelevant background noise. The same guilt traps that once made you bend now bounced off like rubber. The same emotional hooks they used to reel you back in snapped like cheap string. They tried to trigger fear, but you learned neutrality. They tried to trigger shame, but you learned self-honor. They tried to trigger confusion, but you learned clarity. They tried to trigger dependency, but you learned self-sufficiency. And it devastated them, quietly, deeply, and irreversibly. You see, manipulators never prepare for the day their target becomes self-aware. They never imagine the moment when the person they underestimated suddenly stops dancing to invisible strings. They depend on predictable emotional responses: anger, guilt, sadness, confusion, over-explanation, apologizing just to keep peace. But when you outgrow those reflexes, you break their system. You remove the fuel that powers their tactics. You end the game without needing to flip the board. They expected a fight. Instead, you gave them indifference, and that was the one thing they were never trained to handle. And chosen ones, that's when the repercussions began. Not because you attacked them, but because their entire plan depended on your old identity. They were prepared to fight the version of you that needed approval, not the version that knows your worth. They were prepared to manipulate the version of you that feared abandonment, not the version that embraces solitude. They were prepared to guilt-trip the version of you that second-guessed everything, not the version that trusts your inner knowing. They were prepared to control the version of you that needed connection, not the version that understands peace is priceless. When your maturity upgraded, their entire strategy expired. Now they are left with tactics that no longer have targets and illusions that no longer have an audience. What once worked is now useless. What once controlled you now embarrasses them. What once gave them access has turned into a locked door with no spare key. And that, chosen ones, is where their consequences began. Not because life punished them, but because your growth removed the platform their behavior stood on. Their downfall is not unexpected, it is mathematical. When manipulation no longer yields results, it collapses under its own weight. When you stop responding, the energy they use to weaponize ricochets back to them. When you stop being moldable, they become powerless. Your maturity was not just a personal upgrade, it was the end of their influence. And now they are forced to face the raw truth. They never had power, they only had access. And once access was denied, their illusion shattered. That is the real consequence. That is why they are spiraling. That is why everything feels different for them now. My dear chosen ones, never underestimate the silent force of self-evolution. You didn't just grow, you outgrew them. Number 9, they mistook your deep emotional awareness for lack of critical perception. They thought a kind heart meant an unarmed mind. My dear chosen ones, remember this. Some people only recognize sharp blades, so they never notice when you're carrying silent wisdom instead. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey where your greatest strength is so misunderstood that it becomes the very reason people attempt to manipulate you. In your case, that strength was empathy, not emotional softness, not blind trust, not gullibility, but empathetic intelligence, the kind that sees through actions and into intentions. Yet the ones who mistreated you assumed something dangerously incorrect, that because you felt deeply, you couldn't think sharply. They genuinely believed that caring and clarity could not coexist in the same person. They assumed empathy automatically meant naivety, as if emotional awareness was a weakness instead of a highly advanced form of perception. They looked at the way you listened with sincerity, the way you tried to understand where others were coming from, the way you offered patience instead of pressure, and they concluded that you were unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. They mistook emotional depth for intellectual absence. They misread your silence as confusion, your compassion as blindness, and your forgiveness as permission. They operated under the belief that if someone does not react instantly, they must not recognize the game being played. What they never prepared for, not even in the smallest way, was that empathy is not the opposite of intelligence. It is intelligence with emotional context, the kind that studies energy instead of excuses and intentions instead of explanations. My dear chosen ones, empathy is not softness. It is a mental radar wrapped in emotional understanding. Empathy can read the vibration of a sentence, not just the words. Empathy can identify inconsistencies in tone before the story even changes. Empathy can sense an emotional shift before a behavioral shift appears. That is not weakness. That is advanced awareness. People who lack empathy believe in what they see. Empathetic minds believe in what they feel and what they sense, which is far closer to the truth than fakery or performance. You were never blind to their tactics. You were observing, recording, analyzing, and waiting, not because you didn't know, but because you wanted to see if they would correct themselves or expose themselves. You weren't clueless. You were collecting answers without asking questions. You weren't easy to fool. You simply gave people the space to reveal their true nature without interference. There is a rare brilliance in letting people think they are winning while you quietly prepare your exit. That's not innocence. That's emotional strategy. Chosen ones are not controlled by impulses. They are controlled by insight. While others react, you process. While others panic, you decode. While others expose themselves in anger, you expose truth through silence. You cared enough to understand, but you were wise enough not to self-destruct in response. That is what separated you from those who tried to use you. These individuals could not comprehend that empathy is built on awareness, and awareness is built on observation. They thought you didn't react because you didn't notice, but the truth is you didn't react because you saw too much. You recognized the insecurity behind their disrespect, the jealousy behind their fake encouragement, the fear behind their dominance, and the emptiness behind their cruelty. You saw them clearly even when they hid behind practiced expressions, selective generosity, or carefully calculated tone. And because of that clarity, you didn't cling, you quietly detached. They never realized your forgiveness was not about reopening doors. It was about closing emotional accounts without leaving debt behind. Empathy also gave you a unique advantage they will never understand. You learned to navigate their energy without absorbing it. You did not allow their chaos to contaminate your inner world. You didn't let their emotional instability rewrite your character. You didn't adopt their behavior just to prove a point. That level of emotional discipline is rare, and only those who have endured deeply are capable of it. Now, chosen ones, the shift is noticeable. Those who once believed they outsmarted you cannot comprehend why their influence no longer works. They are confused because you no longer react the way you used to. They don't understand how they lost access, control, or effect. They cannot grasp how someone they once underestimated became someone who cannot be manipulated at all. They never imagined empathy would become your shield, not your weakness. And now reality is circling around them like a mirror they cannot escape. They don't understand why consequences are aligning so specifically, but you do, because intent always cycles back to its source, especially when aimed at someone who sees but does not attack. Everything they attempted to orchestrate around you is reflecting back at them, while you stand untangled, self-aware, wiser, and unavailable to repeat cycles. They confused your empathy with naivety. But now they finally see that empathy was your advantage, not your downfall. And that revelation will echo in them longer than any apology ever could. And with that, chosen ones, let this truth rest where it belongs, not as a memory of what hurt you, but as a reminder of what awakened you, what was meant to break you reshaped you, what was meant to confuse you clarified you, and what was meant to silence you upgraded your voice. This journey was intentional. Your rise is intentional, and the repercussions unfolding now are not coincidence. They are the return wave of everything sent your way. If this resonated, like this video, subscribe for more, share it with someone who needs it, and drop 77 in the comments to confirm your rise.